Good afternoon, or greetings. It might not be afternoon when you're watching this. It's afternoon here at Hillsdale. Great. Today what I'd like to do, this is History of Economic Thought 1, Econ 355, Hillsdale College. I want to talk about John Stuart Mill. Mill lived 1806 to 1873, J.S. Mill. And in some respects, we can think of him as being the pinnacle or the high point of the classical school, the really high development of it. He was a brilliant economist. He was a brilliant political philosopher, quite important. And his story will also illustrate the weaknesses of the school. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to talk about his background, a little bit about some of his policy ideas, and kind of where he comes from too. But the heart of our economics will be this discussion of value theory and distribution and redistribution. Now I really like Mill, I admire him. But when we look at this, we're going to see what the weaknesses of classical economics are, and we'll see why it is not sustained. The story of John Stuart Mill actually begins with his father, James Mill. We mentioned James before because he had written the book Elements of Political Economy, which developed Ricardo's ideas. He was a popularizer. He was an important friend of Ricardo and pushed those ideas. Well, it turns out that James Mill also had some very definite ideas about child rearing, and little John Stuart was his test case. So here's John Stuart Mill's upbringing. By age 3, he could speak and read Greek. He had mastered Latin by age 8, and by age 12, he had read numerous classics in the original language, Greek or Latin. He had also read the English histories, and at age 13, he took his first college course in political economy. Wow, 13. And his father was a strict teacher and disciplinarian, so they would take daily walks together, and little John Stuart was supposed to recount during the walks everything he had read the day before. And so when he was going to go on getting ready for a walk with his father, he would take very careful notes. And when James Mill decided he would write his Elements of Political Economy, his version of Ricardo, they took walks. And what they did, James would lecture to his little son, John Stuart. John Stuart would then go home, write notes based on those lectures, present them to his father for critique, and those notes then became the basis for James Mill's book, Elements. Once the Elements was finished, John Stuart Mill was told he had to read and recite Ricardo on their walks. And after he had done Ricardo, then they did the same thing with Wealth of Nations. And his father would give him criticisms of this. Well, this only can go so far, and pretty soon you've exhausted it. So at age 14, little John Stuart was sent, well, he's not little by then, at age 14, John Stuart was sent to France for a year so that he could live with Jean-Baptiste Say and study economics with him. Age 15, he returns to England and he moves in with Jeremy Bentham for 3 years, becomes Bentham's assistant, and he also starts studying law. By age 16, he was publishing his own work. Wow. How old are you guys? What have you done so far? This is an excellent education. He has studied with the best people in the world in the field of economics, and he is, not surprisingly, at the top. It's an excellent education. It's emotionally grueling. He becomes a dedicated and brilliant economist, a Benthamite, a Ricardian. He's a logician. He actually wrote what is considered to be the most important English language work on logic up to that point. 1843, his book, The System of Logic. He was a social reformer. He was a libertarian. He's sometimes accused of socialism. I don't think that's a fair criticism. I understand why people make it. I don't think he was a socialist. Age 21, 1827, he edits a 5-volume work by Bentham on the evidence in law called The Rationale of Judicial Evidence. And shortly thereafter, all of this stuff takes its toll, and he suffers an emotional collapse. He has a nervous breakdown, goes into deep depression. It has something to do with the way his upbringing has been. And one evening, he says to himself, if all of the social reforms I am promoting are realized, will I be any happier? No. And he plunges in this deep despair, and he goes kind of crazy. He starts thinking of things like, one day all the combinations of musical notes will have been put together, and there'll be no more new music. And it's like, he goes into deeper and deeper and deeper despair. He's trying to get out of it, and he starts reading romantic poets. He reads Coleridge, he reads Wordsworth, and it starts helping him to kind of snap out of it. And then something great happens. He falls in love. He meets Harriet Taylor. She's wonderful. She's young, beautiful, bright, and his life is starting to turn around. And Mrs. Taylor, she's a young married woman. Their relationship is well behaved, on the up and up, and but she's married. She's married to a really, really old man. He's like 80 years old, Mr. Taylor. And suddenly, Mr. Taylor, if I should say happily, he dies. It's not good, so good for him. But John Stewart and Harriet are in love, and they marry, and they have great happiness. And she encourages and inspires him, fills his emotional vacuum. He's out of the dumps. He's overjoyed. It's great. They work together. They write books together and things. And after 7 years of wedded bliss, she dies. Mill is deeply hurt by this, but he remains functional and productive. He doesn't go back into that. He understands how to deal with it now. And he continues to be very productive and very successful in his life. Some of his important works, I will just mention a couple of them. One of them is On Liberty, 1859. That's an important libertarian work in which he makes a case for freedom and the free market based on, makes a case for civil liberties based on economic ideas. So for example, he talks about, in this book, about why the importance of having freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of the press is because there's a marketplace of ideas, and that's the way that we will have, you have to have ideas be free to compete so that the best ones can win. It's the only way we have of improving. Free competition for ideas. So he makes an economic argument for those sorts of things. Another book that he publishes, Harriet helped him write that one. Another one that he writes is 1870, On the Subjection of Women. This is an extremely important work. If you'll remember the Contagious Disease Acts that I mentioned, had infringed on the rights of women. And there were also something called the Married Women's Property Act, by which is the moment that a woman married, she lost all rights to her property. It became the property of her husband, and then if he was abusive, then they divorced. Well, that wasn't hers. It's not hers any longer. And so this was a defense of the rights of women, and this was a crucial work that he wrote, crucial for the repeal of the Married Women's Act, Married Women's Property Act, and Contagious Disease Acts and things like that. So an important social reformer who wrote a really nice little piece, which the name escapes me, but you can find this online, on war. And it was about the Civil War, and it begins something along the lines of, war is a terrible thing. But there is something worse than war, and that's not having anything that you would, not ever being willing to fight for any principle. And it's a condemnation of slavery, and it's a very, very good analysis, I think, of his position on the Civil War and slavery and why it's important that slavery be defeated. Great. But for our purposes, we want to stick to the economics now. And in 1848, he wrote many things in economics, but in particular, his principles of political economy. Principles of political economy. For all I know, it may have been used as a textbook at Hillsdale College. I don't know. I would love to find out what was used here. That would be a very distinct possibility. It was used up into 1900, around 1900, really. It's a modernization of the Wealth of Nations and of Ricardo, modern for the time he wrote it. It was a standard textbook up into the 1900s. And I'll say something about it. It's divided into 5 books, So it's a volume, but as he calls it, 5 books. And the first one is production. These are the sections. And the next one is distribution and exchange. Each one of these is a theoretical treatment, section of theory. And then influence of the progress of society. Influence of the progress of society on production and distribution. Production and distribution. And then finally, influence of government. I want to say something about this because it's quite, there's some important points here. And he is, like most of the classicals, an advocate of laissez-faire, non-interventionism. But look at a couple of things here. Production and distribution are separated and treated separately. And as I said, that might make sense analytically, but Friedrich Hayek says great harm was done in separating these because it leads people to not realize that those are not separate steps or separate things, but it's all part of what the market does. But it leads people to think socialism is possible. We will make a production decision and then a separate decision about how to distribute what has been produced. So Hayek thinks that Mill did more than anyone else to make socialism acceptable. I don't know that I buy that, but Hayek argues this. But remember that Jean-Baptiste Say had also done this. What else do we have here? Well, what's missing? Where's consumption? Where's demand? I suppose it could, there's no treatment of demand, no attention to demand or utility. That is omitted. This section, we'll come back and talk about that a little bit, because this progress of society is a section that asks, what happens once society is fully advanced and we hit Adam Smith's stationary state, or Ricardo's stationary state? And then do we have some different possible policy implications of that? So we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to it. Good. But let me first talk about his work in value theory, and then we'll get to the distribution, redistribution questions. So that's our background. And I just clear this up. Great. Well, he's a Ricardian. And so he basically takes the Ricardian view. And we're going to see weaknesses in this value theory, some pretty serious weaknesses. And that's what makes classical economics so vulnerable to attack. From on the one hand, from Marxism, and on the other hand, from the marginal revolution. Those will come in HET II when we get to that. So for Mill, value theory is a fundamental question. And Mill says, I think we now understand that there are 3 classes of commodities, 3 kinds of things. And the first one is class 1. Class 1 would be things that are not reproducible. They're absolutely limited in supply. So this is not reproducible. And this is not a very important category, he thinks, but it is, you think of something like the Mona Lisa. There's only one, you don't manufacture a whole bunch of them. Rembrandt paintings or something like this, unique artworks, but also very short-run commodities. So you could think of, he says, labor. At some point in time, there are only so many workers. Or international trade goods. You know, the French have just unloaded their shipment of, we just unloaded the shipment of French goods from the French ship, and you can't augment that until next year or whenever the next ship comes. So that's a fixed amount. Or monopolized goods. A monopoly might do this. And so he describes it this way. This is stuff that's absolutely limited in supply, and he says The value which a commodity will bring in any market is no other than the value which in that market gives a demand just sufficient to carry off the existing or expected supply. So he's kind of conflating in that language demand and quantity demanded. But we can see it this way. This is what he calls the law of demand and supply. We can graph it somewhat anachronistically because he did not graph it this way. Dollars per unit, and there's the number of units, and there's our fixed supply. If it's the Mona Lisa, there's just one. And if it's the stock of goods that have just been dropped off on the dock, whatever it is, but there's our supply. And as he says, whatever price will just carry that off, that'll be the price. Good. P star. Now, cost of production here, there's no story about cost of production. It's entirely demand driven, but there's no study of demand and no study of what might drive demand. Nothing like that. No theory of demand here. And he says, okay, good, it's not very important. Let's look at class 2. Since that was not important, let's just get it out of here. We'll leave class 2 and class 3 out. Together. We have class 2. Class 2 is manufacturing. Manufacturing, well, that's a kind of industrial process. What he really means is commodities that are the result of labor and expenditure, as he put it. And he says these can be increased indefinitely. There's a constant cost assumption. You see that in so much of the classical economics. So he imagines, though, that it's a factory or workshop that manufactures things. And if you can make an atlatl for $100, well, just if a factory can do that, make another factory just like it. You can double your atlatl supply. Make another factory just like that. Just keep making more factories. You can expand indefinitely. And so we have, in other words, cost of production, whatever that happens to be. And then we have a demand, whatever it happens to be. It's called D naught, something like that. And that will tell us what the quantity to be produced is, but the price, we know, will be the cost of production. And that's a constant cost story, and that's the end of the story. Capital and labor, that's it. Great. Now he knows, of course, that this is what Adam Smith called the natural price. It's the long equilibrium price, and of course we can vary from that. But if we know that if the price is greater than cost of production, what happens? Well, people enter that market, or production will expand and drive the price back down. If price is less than cost of production, people will exit the market, people will produce less, the price will come back up, so it will converge to this. That's the long run price. That's going to be the long run. I should put that over here, long run equilibrium price here. And we can think of that as being really the supply curve. That's how Alfred Marshall will note it. Great. That's our equilibrium position. So for him, except for short run disturbances, demand doesn't make any difference for price, for value. That's what it will be, cost of production, and that's fixed. Okay, great. And he says, what would that be in this case? Cost of production would be equal to the wages plus the profits. Okay. That is to say, labor and capital. The payments to labor and the payments to the capital. That's it. Great. It's a very clear statement of Ricardo. Next, move to the next class, and that's class 3. Class 3 are increasing cost industries. And remember, this was constant cost. So these can be expanded, but only at increasing cost of production. And what's that? That's agriculture, because remember that the quantity of land is fixed, the quantity of, we have the quantity of particularly fertile land is fixed, and cost of production will be determined at the intensive and extensive margins, and we have falling marginal product on those. And so we have cost of production is determined at the margin where the cost is greatest. And as we saw last few lectures ago, we have dollars per unit of output, and that would give us an increase in cost industry, and there's the quantity of output. And simply draw a marginal cost curve. That's the marginal cost of production, and we can think of that later as a supply curve. Draw a demand curve in, and whatever quantities, that is the price right there. That is, the cost of that last unit will be determining the price. It's a cost of production story still. Okay? Great. Now, remember what Ricardo has told us about this. Ricardo says, in this case, we have cost of production is equal to profits. This is Ricardo, of course. Speaking of agriculture, because that's, of course, where we're linking to this. Profits plus wages, right? And he says rents are a residual. And again, by residual, we mean it's just what's left over. It's not really a factor payment. If you don't pay it, the land doesn't go away. So for Ricardo, it's an unnecessary additional payment. And Mill, being a good Ricardian, says, yeah, profits and wages and the rents, also a residual, unless. It depends, because that assumes that there's no alternative use for the land. And if there is an alternative use for the land, then these rents suddenly become a necessary payment, because those rents will direct the land into the most highly valued use. So then they're not an unnecessary payment. So Smith may well have been right when he coming down. Great. That's actually a weakness in Ricardian theory that Mill has just pointed out. But Mill does this work, and then he says, well, there it is. There is absolutely nothing more to say. The theory of the theory of value, the theory of price is complete. There's nothing more to say. And he's right on the verge of the marginal revolution, which completely upsets all of this. But that will be a story for later. Great. Well, he largely sidesteps the whole story of demand, so he really misses the whole point here. He does later explicitly, in some of his work, discuss demand and supply schedules, and he does that when he treats international trade, interestingly enough, but I would skip that. But this is Mill on price theory. And he sees these three classes of goods, no theory of demand, everything fundamentally driven by cost in all of the important cases. That's, of course, marginal cost of production. So it's all cost of production theory, and that's it. All right, great. Well, what does that have to do then with, where does that take us then with respect to distribution? So let's go ahead and clear this, and we shall see. Whenever I think of Mill saying, there's nothing more to say in value theory. I'm reminded that the head of IBM at one point said he thought that there was a total world market for 5 computers. And that once there were 5 computers, there'd be no more. That would be it. The computers he was talking about, this cell phone, has more computational power than the computers he was talking about. So I suppose if computers hadn't advanced, maybe he'd have been right. Mill could not be more wrong when he says there's nothing more to say about value theory, because there's a great deal more. A fundamental revolution is about to occur. All right, good. Well, let's move on then to distribution and redistribution. And he begins, he's largely in agreement with Ricardo and with Senior. Well, Well, they actually don't quite fit together exactly, but let's see what we can do with this. And this is where we begin maybe to realize that classical economics has some problems. It's trying to jam a bunch of ideas together that don't fit. It's not integrated. So we start out with rents. Okay, these are factor payments, but they also become the payments to the people who own the factor. So it's a theory of distribution, how the income that is produced is distributed. And so rents, he says, are residuals. Unless there's an opportunity cost to using the land. And then they become a necessary factor payment. All right, great. And wages? Obviously, a necessary factor payment. And they will be bound by the iron law. And the iron law means that they will tend to subsistence and not a lot more, because mice in the barn, population will grow, etc. Okay? These also come from what is called a subsistence fund. So the capitalist is putting those forward out of some sort of a capital stock that you saved up. And so they come from I'll mention this, from the wage fund. I think I briefly touched on this when we were talking about Adam Smith. I know the reading, I think from Turgot also mentions this a little bit. This is where the wages are paid, because again, we have the idea that production takes time, therefore the capitalist sets aside a certain amount of wage goods or money that he will use to pay the workers until the fruits of their labor mature and are developed. And once they're developed, then they can be paid out of that. But in the meantime, he has to front them the means of subsistence, and that comes from capital, from the wage fund. That'll be important in a moment. And then finally, we have profits. And profits, that's the payment to the capital owners. And so he says that should cover abstinence. Oh, that's from Senior. So he does take that into account. It can't purely be a labor theory of value then. It has to also cover the wages of the supervisors and managers, who are not really the workers, but they are supervising things. It has to cover risk and depreciation, etc. But necessary payments. Necessary factor payments. Wonderful. And in fact, the argument he makes is that this is the proper system. This is necessary. This is what makes things work. Great. Well, they're not necessarily, as it turns out. The wages are not necessarily bound by the iron law. And in fact, he's going to argue that maybe we could take money away from the capital, take it away from the capitalist, put it in here, and raise wages without hurting the accumulation of capital. And that becomes a really serious debate, problem. Maybe. Well, we'll see. So let's see what he says about this. In 1848, he argues that in his principles, he argues that the wage fund is made up of, in particular, real goods, wage goods, and those will be saved from past production. So we can think of things like, cheap bread, cheap beer, cheap cloth, whatever it is that workmen consume, and they will be advanced to labor so that they can have future production. And the idea is, well, those are necessary payments, and that comes out of here. And so, great. It is, any attempt to raise wages is not going to work in the short run, at least. In fact, it shouldn't work at all. Not through simply trying to increase that. Because if you try to raise the wage fund, well, you will cut all of these things, and then you will see capital decumulate and the economy will start going downhill. So he's confirmed this classical view. But in 1869, he's reviewing someone else's book. It's an obscure economist, William Thornton, not Thornton, who I talked about last time, but Thornton. William Thornton has a piece that he called a book on labor and its claims. And Mill writes what is called his recantation. And he doesn't seem to have thought this was such a big deal. But generally speaking, people did. Because in this recantation, in this book review, he denies that the wage fund is strictly fixed. And he argues, apparently, that if we put union pressure or some other kind of pressure on unions striking or something happening to squeeze profits smaller, you could make this bigger and make wages higher. And yet you would not cut into capital accumulation. And that's what you don't want to do. You don't want to cut capital accumulation because you make yourself poorer. But the idea is this. These profits, everyone thinks, Mill thinks, the profit could be taken and it'll be a payment for risk plus a payment for depreciation plus a payment for abstinence, okay, and plus a payment for the management, we'll call that the supervision. Great, to cover all those things. You have to pay that stuff. Otherwise you'll have capital decumulation. Your economy will shrink. That's a bad thing. And so those profits must be made of those things. And you don't want to make them smaller, so you can't take profit away from here and put it over here unless, what if there's something else? And he seems in 1848 to think there's nothing else. And in 1869, seems to be arguing that there is some sort of unnecessary payment in profit and that you could take this out and move it over here and raise wages without hurting production. Now, the idea is that somehow those capitalist owners could earn less, the workers could earn more, and you wouldn't upset production. He's very careful that he's not arguing that we will cut capital accumulation. He doesn't want to cut those things. Those are necessary, but that there may be something extra. And so your text has a discussion. There's this confusion of money versus real goods and all these kinds of issues, if it's short run or long run. And it's a little unclear what Mill is talking about. And Mill himself doesn't seem to have thought this was such a great deal. But many people look at this and think, oh my gosh, the leading exponent of laissez-faire has just said, capitalists are exploiting the workers. They're taking too much. We could cut profit and raise the wages of the workers. Uh-oh. Great. Well, the main effect is that Ricardian economics' greatest opponent has just called into question the necessity and the justness of the status quo. Great. Well, that brings up some ideas on wealth redistribution. Distribution has already been called into question because maybe the profits are too high. Maybe that's a residual, or maybe not. Maybe that's too low. Oh, geez, now we're in a mess. Let's go ahead and talk about redistribution. So this is part 2 of section 3. Redistribution, and I'll put a question mark on there. Mill speculates on this issue and has some interesting ideas. And I'll just kind of consider them here. So, in the stationary state, Mill argues that if we get to that stationary state where we finally, there's no further expansion of the economy, as we see when the Cord model hits the long-run equilibrium, or if we think of the Malthusian equilibrium, or Smith arguing that eventually profit falls to zero when you've accumulated, profit falls as you accumulate capital, Smith thinks. Well, when we hit that stationary state, The problem production is solved. And so, says Mill, maybe at that point you could do some redistribution and it would be fairer, because he says, the concentrated, especially if we're there, the concentrated ownership of wealth and capital would be partly responsible for the plight of the working classes. You got a lot of poorer people and a few really rich people. And now it's not, if you could change this without hurting growth, without depressing your economy, maybe you make people better off in general. And so Mill looks at this thing and says, maybe there's a role for some limited redistribution. What kinds of things? Well, let's think about the poor laws. And the poor laws are what we would think of today as welfare payments. Poor laws pay money to people, and Mill says, are those things justified or not? And Mill says, if it's a disabled person, yeah, why not? A disabled person who cannot work, we don't want them just dying in the streets. So sure, we can have some taxation and we will give them, for the disabled, yes. Well, do we want to pay able-bodied people? His answer here, for the disabled, yes, it's to no fault of their own that they can't work. But the able-bodied, we're creating incentives for them not to work if we give them welfare. And he says, he puts it this way, he says, we don't want them to starve in the street, so we will give them just a minimum if they're able-bodied, but no more. And it'll be so little that they will have incentive to work and to care for themselves. And if they do accept this, they must be, as he puts it, forced to do irksome and severe labor. We're going to try to create incentives for them not to take welfare. So we will just say here, it's very limited. He doesn't want to have bad incentives to have people stop working. What else? Another one is progressive income tax. What about this one? A progressive income tax would take more money from them. The more you earn, the more you pay, and with increasing rates. Progressive income there. And his answer to that is, what an insane idea. What a terrible idea, because the more you're earning, the more you're creating. You don't want to penalize that. That's counterproductive. So he says no to that. He said it'd be much better, those who are working the hardest are being punished the most, they're creating the most, they're being punished. That's backwards, that's destructive. And instead he says, how about a flat tax, or what Smith calls a proportional tax? And he says, yes, that would be much better. And he also says, what about a tax on unearned income? And this is an interesting question. What do we mean by that? And he says, inheritance taxes. And he says, yeah, it would be okay to tax that as heavily as possible, as long as it doesn't lead to widespread tax evasion. Okay, we don't want to create bad. Every time he thinks of one of these things, he asks, what are the effects on incentives? Will it get bad or good incentive consequences? And so with respect to this, he says, yes, as long as it is taxed as heavily as possible. Well, why? What's he talking about here? I think about this. If people are set up a business and they're creating wealth, they want to pass it on to their children, why not? It seems like a good idea. He's sitting in a different setting. He's imagining, when he writes this, people who are aristocrats who have received estates, and they received these estates because their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather won a sword fight at the Battle of Hastings. And that's the basic reason why they have the big estate and other people don't. And that's not so clear to him that that's a just system. So maybe that kind of inheritance, he's skeptical that that's so great for society. What other things? Taxes on goods, and he says taxes on consumption goods. We might think of a sales tax, or excise tax. Let's call it taxes on consumption goods. And he says, well, it depends. Definitely you do not want to tax workmen's, you don't want to tax basics. That's hurting the poor, it raises the cost of labor, makes things more expensive. That's a terrible idea, it's destructive. But what about luxuries? He says, yeah, taxes on luxuries won't be so harmful, but particularly on snob goods. Things that, he says, nobody really wants to buy. The upper classes, things they don't really want to buy, but they are expected to because they're keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak. So they'd probably be just as happy not having that, so just tax those things. The wealthy people won't lose any well-being, and you'll get more income more wealth that could be used to help the poor in some way. Other kinds of things that he favors are public education, and his idea there is, yes, absolutely. And in particular, I put the exclamation point, put it there. He says, in particular, we'll teach capitalist values. We'll teach them the importance of the free market, hard work. We'll teach people to have skills. Remember Adam Smith's argument that you don't want people to just be doing this division of labor stuff that turns them into brutes. You want to stimulate them, make them better citizens. And in fact, when he publishes his books, he makes sure they also come out in very cheap working man's editions, and he doesn't take royalties on those. He wants his ideas to be widespread to the poor, or to the less well off. Minimum wage, terrible idea, he thinks. Minimum wage, we will just say no. And again, the people who receive it, it leads to population expansion for them, and it also causes unemployment. So he thinks this is, again, a terrible idea. So everything he focuses on is incentive driven. That's what I like about it, whether I agree with him on any of these points or not. One more thing he advocates is the reform of property laws to protect poor people's property. Be fair, make it easy for people to accumulate wealth, get out of poverty. Make it easier for them to defend them, to write and have business contracts and things. Uneven protection hurts the poor. Help them accumulate capital. And so he, for example, proposes flat fees for land transactions would be very, very low. Now, great, that's Mill. And you can see that he's got ideas here. And he thinks that maybe when we get to this stationary state, we can have some income, some wealth redistribution, as long as we don't cut into capital. Well, Hayek says, look, all of this stuff makes socialism seem acceptable to people. And it's coming from an advocate of laissez-faire, so this is dangerous. Yeah, maybe. Before we condemn him as a socialist, Lionel Robbins puts it this way. He says it's easy for us to commit to condemn Hill as being left-wing here, and to defend the legitimacy of existing property rights. But go ahead and explain to a brilliant young man whose basic options are working in a factory that this is a just system, when the main reason is that you were born to poor parents instead of aristocrats. And the British system is rather class-bound, and so perhaps not so fair. And that's what Mill is addressing. So, at any rate, Hayek ends up saying that maybe we will have to have this kind of agreeing that inequality might be bad. And in some ways, Hayek seems kind of Millian to me. But there we are with John Stuart Mill. And he represents, in many respects, the highest development of Ricardian economics, classical economics. He understands the actor's systematic response to incentives. He understands laissez-faire, coordination by the invisible hand, ideas of economic growth, incentives, institutions, and these things. Great understanding of unintended consequences. He's got the quantity theory of money, notions like that. He also shows the signs of its collapse. The value theory doesn't hang together. The price theory doesn't hang together. Three different kinds of goods, and they really have differing explanations for what will determine the price. The class 1, class 2, class 3. Three different kinds of inputs. Like what determines We still don't know. What determines profits? What determines wages? What determines rents? We can't even agree on, can't even decide whether rents are a necessary payment or exploitation. And maybe that's so profits. That's an inadequate defense of laissez-faire policy conclusion. Everything is now in doubt. And there's a false theory of population built into this because people aren't mice in the barn. And there's no treatment of technological advance. And there's an objective theory of wealth. They're treating goods, not gold, but still not, it's just something not right about. And there are two basic lines of response to this. And the first one is socialism, and the second one is the marginalist revolution and modern economics. And so we're going to cover those when we get to history of economic thought 2, if you're staying with the course, if you're staying with the course, we'll be covering those. So that's John Stuart Mill, important and interesting figure. And that basically will wrap up the bulk of what we're doing for this course. I'm going to do one more short lecture in which I will tie together a few loose ends and also talk about one more figure who I think is kind of straddles eras. He's kind of interesting. So we'll come back and we'll have one more lecture on this. And so until then, stay positive, work hard, and hope to see you soon.